Hola, 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 my captivated spirits. Welcome to Sessions of Spirit number 32. You're probably new and a bit of an Adorno fanatic or fan, and this session is just for you. You're coming in a little bit late to the party. We are doing a comparison with Hegel, but I'm going to give this nice backwards recap so that you have some context of where we are, because the terminology is going to sound familiar. We're going to be using familiar words, but in an unfamiliar way, what Hegel calls a speculative living way. So by this point, some of it might not make sense unless you've studied Adorno intensely. So you probably have a better chance of understanding than maybe the average person who didn't have a chance to let their inner philosopher come forward. So I'm going to try and do this recap of 32 sessions in 2 minutes. 2 to 3 minutes. So let's begin now. Session number 1, Hegel was the greatest because he had this tremendous wisdom standing on the shoulders of like 115 giants of philosophy. Number 2 is that it was in one system that people couldn't comprehend for the last 200 years. Number 3 is that that system allows you to change the entire world. Number 4 is that you get beyond the superficial understanding of Hegel and you get to this profound understanding, which 5 leads you to the circle of reason, which 6 sounds religious, but philosophy, at least the genuine kind, is the sublation of that, not only the negation. Number 7 is we're going to win a Nobel Peace Prize with this understanding by putting that kind of logic into universal logic. Number 8 is that this universal logic starts with polemics, but that's not the end. Number 9 is that you negate that negation into a sublation, which number 10 results in this master class around the circle of reason, which is sublation, which number 11 is the ineffable speaking itself. Number 12 is that this is profound in the purpose of life. Number 13 is you got to do this for everybody and liberate everyone because everyone deserves it. Number 14 is that this kind of thinking allows you to connect to God, which number 15 atheistically means connecting to your inner child and who you really are. Number 16 is that our gurus have been doing this for thousands of years implicitly. Number 17 is we have to sublate old mysticism with the new mysticism. Hegel says science is actually mystical, but scientifically. Number 18 is that this is really fun when you do it properly. You flow with the universe. To 19, negate things with laughter. As number 20, an ideal philosopher. Who 21 overcomes evil and ignorance with these wisdom quizzes by sublating one-sidedness. And then 22, you get rid of the one-sidedness in the practical world with these disruptive particular technologies like CRISPR, where philosophy doesn't really seem to be governing it with wisdom. It seems to be its own beast, which is kind of concerning. We need to get philosophers in control of our disruptive technologies, which are growing at exponential rates. Number 23 is that we have to make this logic more concrete and noble and determinate by using practical tools like the synchronicity document of philosophies. Number 24 is that we introduce a new world spirit with these types of practical tools and this type of interpersonal dynamic using the science of logic. Number 25 is we gave particular real examples of how to do that in our current time with particular religions. And we did that also in session number 26 with the opposite of religions, which is, more atheistic secular consciousness and existentialism. And 27, we're not just doing individually, we're doing this as a community. So we also sublated capitalism, socialism, and communism to get rid of this or sublate this existential crisis collectively and get to a 28, a more spiritual understanding, which kind of leads us back to this kind of atheistic religious consciousness, which Buddhism is usually thought of as embodying. But 29, we actually sublate not just Buddhism, but also absolute atheism itself. To 30, arrive at us as the sublation, and 31 is the last session was about how language itself is not just something we do, but itself is speaking us in a certain metaphysical way. And in order to understand Hegel and how profound you really are and what you're grappling with, you need to understand it. Okay, not too bad. Over 2 minutes, but I think under 3. That brings us to today. 32, SOS. SOS stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also at the same time save our souls, because as I said earlier, real genuine philosophy is supposed to change the world and make it better. The title today is Adorno and the Horror of Dialectic. You can see my picture here has to do with Lord of the Rings. We're trying to take Hegel and philosophy out of the ivory tower and give it to everyone, because everyone is technically in the spirit of genuine philosophy if you let the wisdom come forward and we teach this universal logic. So he says, I have my self-consciousness not in myself, but in the other, which sounds contradictory, right? Because how can you be you and the other? That's how Hegel think speculatively, and we're going to explain this. But let's start with our summary paragraph. I have two quotes from Adorno. He says, "Horror is beyond the reach of psychology." And then, "When I speak of negative dialectics, not the least important reason for doing so is my desire to dissociate myself from this fetishization of the positive." So here's the essence of the talk. To Adorno, dialectics were anything but convenient. Despite grasping the power of sublation, there always seemed to be a moment of tarrying needed. Adorno called Hegel's dialectic negative dialectics to emphasize that we are never free from negation. When we see our opposite, it at first appears as horror. We do not understand it. We do not identify with our other. But the ideal philosopher recognizes the pattern, that the good is inherent and reason automatically progresses to what is ideal and true, even if contradictions can result in nullity. The ultimate phenomenology of this perspective is not therefore a horror, but an immediate sublation of that horror as a self-recognition and making sense. We idealize that horror so that we have the power and wisdom to stop it, and not naively by abstractly negating it or fleeing from it, but by going deep into the heart of its truth and reconciling it with its ideal nature, where it can become beautiful again. This is self-recognition. This is what Hegel calls love. The universal language game, circularity of genuine reason, and the speculative nature of pure thought transcends the fixity of the understanding, and we move beyond the limits of sensuousness and particular knowledge. Nature becomes reasonable as we realize its actuality and our place in it as ideal. We recognize ourselves in its universality. We belong in non-identity. Hopefully, if you're an Adorno lover and you self-recognize with him, you have your self-consciousness in him, this session will unpack this paragraph satisfactorily. So last session, let's pick up in this growing fashion, right? We're not just abstractly progressing through these 38 sessions of spirit. We're actually trying to do some version of the living logic and find the inner unity behind these concepts in these sessions that look abstract, like they're not connected. We've covered a lot of ground from Eckhart Tolle to now Adorno to Buddhism. These things in our ordinary world and ordinary thinking aren't really connected. They're actually fighting each other. There's a lot of conflict in our world because we don't have this living logic. So last session, we talked about Wittgenstein and how language is really tricky. It has this trick to it. And we found that that trick was just the logic in its speculative nature turning into its opposites. And to resolve it, you have to grasp it, those contradictions in a concrete unity, not in an abstract indeterminate unity, right? So this kind of leads us to really weird contradictory sentences that we can speak when we're talking in this speculative way. Like Hegel was saying at the end of last session, the object that is no object, the distinction that is no distinction, the difference that is no difference. I am with myself, but I am not myself. My object is mine, but it is not mine. Like all these, like, okay, well, you're just playing with my mind. But when you talk like that, you are actually grasping some version of the absolute profound truth. Koans in Buddhism was also talking about this. But you can use this in an abusive way. So you can use it in the right way, which is what Hegel gives us. He says he's tired of the way philosophy is going and people being sophists, basically. And the really intelligent people that don't quite grasp sublation, they implicitly kind of grasp it. It's kind of what intelligence is. And they implicitly know how to work that speculative dynamic to sort of manipulate conversations into whatever you want, because all sides are true. So if you know how to bounce back and forth, you can do some pretty terrible things if you don't have spirit at your core and truth seeking at your core. So where we're going to begin with Adorno is kind of in the psychology again of this process. And of course, Adorno has a very negative kind of connotation to him. Like a lot of people love him. We don't mean negative that way. But we mean that his philosophy was focusing more on the negative side of dialectic, or the negative results, rather than, of course, we know now the positive result. Remember, there's two results to every dialectic, and dialectic itself is only the second moment or second side of logic. So everything logical, like Hegel says, we have to have faith that the world is rational. Everything that is rational, and everything that is rational is actual, and it all happens through logic. But real logic has three moments to it always. If you're missing a moment, it's abstract, right? So the first one is abstract understanding. The second one is the dialectical moment, or the negative moment of reason. And then the third one is the positive moment of reason, which is the sublation, the negation of negation. So when we talk about negative, we mean that second moment. And so this is really what Adorno seems to be highlighting. And this quote here, the first quote is, horror is beyond the reach of psychology. Horror is actually very negative. And we mean it not just in this logical sense, we mean it in every sense, that badness is something that happens, and it doesn't just happen in a superficial way. It's to the core unavoidably terrible. And that's what makes it actually more horrible, is that even once you acknowledge the horror, it doesn't stop it. So it just keeps happening in this horrible kind of, as sentient creatures, it's even worse for us than maybe animals, because we really feel things more deeply, and it's traumatizing. So I think Adorno is trying to highlight that in his type of dialectics, we want to get away from this kind of positive dialectic, which I think ironically creates a lot of suffering in the world. And Hegel kind of agrees, as we talked about earlier, the Lord and all this kind of stuff from religion had a lot of good things to it, but it also had a lot of exploitation and abuse to it, because people weren't allowed to think for themselves. And so this is kind of, I think, Adorno doing the same thing, not realizing that Hegel had already done it. Because most people read Hegel and it's so speculative that people don't know what to make, like heads or tails. Like you think you got a grasp of him, and then all of a sudden he's saying the opposite thing, but you just like ignore that for a bit and just like keep to your side, right? Because that's what makes sense to you. That's what the ego wants. So you're just saying, well, this is a superficial thing that Hegel is saying. He's just saying it as a caveat or something. And no, Hegel really is going to the extremes of both sides. And Adorno wanted to return science as this sort of process of truth finding, rather than this religious consciousness, which was really frustrating in the last 40, 50, 60 years ago, when science was trying to still emerge in its pure form. So I think Adorno's goal was to say, no, you need to be critical. And the religious consciousness, of course, wasn't really critical. It was getting sucked into this superstition and non-questioning attitude that just took the essence as it is. They didn't really determine it for themselves. They were sort of stuck in the faith mode and relied on intuition and external authority, which kept this abuse going, So he wants to end this by saying, no, we have to focus on the negative to get the critical in there, to get the science in there, We don't want the religious right Hegelians and all these types of guys messing up the dialectic. And, it sounds like Hegel might have been religious, maybe at least Adorno, where he didn't realize that Hegel actually did a great job. So here, this is why I think Adorno is really focusing on the negative, because he thinks in society it's really one-sided on the opposite. It's too positive. So that's why he's saying negative dialectics. And that's also why this horrible component is not even just in our heads. It seems to be inherent to reality itself. So it is a little bit metaphysical. So it's kind of what Wittgenstein was verging on too in the last session. These really intelligent guys, when you have like enough intelligence, you automatically start seeing the contradictory nature of the universe, because you have the capacity to hold so much. And so, Wittgenstein said, so let's go to the next point here. So Wittgenstein said yesterday something like, where one cannot speak, one must remain silent. And there's something horrible in that. There's also something good, right? The Tao, what we talked about in the previous sessions about putting the Tao into analytic notation, which is a contradiction, because the Tao is the thing that, if you can name it, is not the real Tao, right? It's the ineffable. But we showed how the ineffable starts speaking itself from itself, nothing external, but there's a trick to it. But there's a really horrible way that this can also happen. And Wittgenstein kind of says it in a frustrating way. It's like you can't articulate something, it's frustrating, but I think that there's an even more terrible thing that happens. And I haven't read enough Adorno to know if he talks about this, but I'm going to go into it anyway and show that I think what he's hitting on is metaphysical dialectics, which Hegel did perfectly, or at least in a tremendous new way, with the science of logic. We covered 2 sessions ago that really is an objective. Oh no, we did that yesterday. That's an objective world that seems to exist before we exist. We're implicit in that world. If you want to keep consciousness around, we're just implicit, observing it as its own observance, incredibly, which is what Eckhart Tolle kind of talks about by getting out of the moment, or getting into the moment by kind of getting out of the particularity of the moment. But this silence can create what's called double binds. So you can see here in red, this is really critical. And red is often associated with love, right? Roses and stuff like that, but it can also be associated with rage and pain. So double binds, I put the definition here. And some people who might be in psychiatry or in the psychological sciences might recognize this. But we're going to show that, yes, this is beyond psychology, but it's only beyond finite psychology. Hegel doesn't just berate or criticize psychology. Hegel's really in his introduction to the logics, he's really critical of psychology, calls it down, and he says, no, it's not like this onion thing, and it sounds like he doesn't like psychology. But then, hypocritically, if you read his philosophy of spirit, in the first moment, which is subjective spirit, it develops in 3 moments, like syllogism, right? It has the first moment as anthropology. Then the second moment is phenomenology, which is where the phenomenology of spirit picks up from, his first book. And then the third moment is psychology. He calls it that. So he has his own psychology. He's only negating something about the finite psychology that doesn't make it infinite. And it's this living syllogistic logic. And this is what Adorno's kind of talking about. There's a limit to psychology. There's a metaphysical part of it, which is the syllogism that Hegel already talked about. But here I'm going to give you the finite version of what double binds are. But we're going to recognize the metaphysical objective logic that's behind it, the dialectical speculative stuff. So our science, our finite sciences like psychiatry are actually starting to get advanced enough that they're verging on this. The spiritual kind of stuff is being incorporated into science. And this is kind of a good example. So double bind is a dilemma in communication in which an individual or group receives 2 or more reciprocally conflicting messages. So if you read in the comments here, I put a lot in these comments for you, so you guys know that this I'm taking from Hegel. I'm actually putting quotes in here for you guys. Communication sounds very ordinary, but to Hegel, it's actually pretty profound. Communication doesn't really formally develop until the last third of his logic. So all the stuff before, the being, the something, the other, the thing in itself, all of these things that look like objects or communicating with things they're not solid enough as beings to actually have real communication between 2 solid things. Like a more external communication is still very internal. It's like the same thing moving and altering in itself. But when you get to the end of the notion, which we covered earlier, right? That's the truth. You have the universal, the particular, and the individual. If you can't put something, whatever you're looking at in the universe, into those 3 elements, you're not really looking at it scientifically, according to Hegel. You have to know and understand the order of those 3, and then you develop the notion into its syllogism as the completed form of the notion. And we saw that how its outward forms as a syllogism is just a replication of its elements on the inside of itself in an abstract way. So the object comes out of the completed syllogism. So all these objects that look concrete in our world are actually completed syllogisms. And we need to peer into them to think them properly, like truthfully. We have to find the syllogistic form of them. But when you grasp the syllogism immediately, it turns into an object. And then what happens is that object, like the first moment of the object, the abstract concept of it, the notion of it, others itself into the second moment of logic, right? Or the second moment, of logic, which is the dialectical moment, which is process. It's the negative moment which allows movement from the static, abstract universal. And so it starts working itself out in that form of objects. You get multiple objects kind of like negating each other. So for the first time, you get 2 objects that are actually independent enough of each other to have external communication. And that's kind of like billiard balls, kind of like in mechanics, right? There's no real consciousness here yet. We don't mean this in the human sense. We just mean that in terms of logic, this communication between 2 different things, the relationship itself is also growing, not just the objects. We are literally rebuilding reality from like almost like nothingness straight to like the most concrete form of reality, which is what we are. That's why all this psychological stuff actually is metaphysical logic coming through in sensuous form. So the metaphysics, the science of logic, is repeating itself in our world, the world of nature. And I think Adorno uses this word, or it's used in philosophy, called hypostasis or hypostatic development where you make something corporeal. So that's kind of what we are. So when we mean communication here in double binds, we mean that we actually have two kind of individuals communicating. And this logic kind of becomes important because you can't hold the logic in an order. It doesn't really make sense in a deeper way of thinking of the logic about it. That's what we're going to unpack with the rest of the double binds. He's talking about reciprocal conflicting messages. What he's talking about is that with the triad, with these syllogisms, you're picking a side, but you're not allowed to choose that side. And so if you try and jump to the other side, it's also wrong. So it doesn't matter which side of the dialectic, which moment you're in, it's not treated as right. You're not able to get to the truth. And he says, in some scenarios with families or romantic situations or relationships, this can be emotionally distressing, creating a situation in which a successful response to one message results in a failed response to the other, and vice versa, such that the person responding will automatically be perceived as in the wrong, no matter how they respond. This double bind prevents the person from either resolving the underlying dilemma or opting out of the situation. So another way of saying this is that you're basically in a no-win situation. So if you're with somebody and you choose option one and they say, I don't like that, and you say, oh, okay, then you must not, must want option two. And they say, I don't like that either. Then you're kind of confused, like, okay, then I guess you mean some version of the middle ground. And then you choose that and you're also wrong. Then no position you choose on that dialectic can satisfy them. You're being negated. You can't stop the abstract negation. And when you can't stop an abstract negation, because you have a conscious connection with somebody else, right? You're connected to them with this underlying inner unity of things. It starts to affect you. It starts to work on you. The negation starts to tarry on you, on that metaphysical inner essence in the world of pure thought. And you can try and resist it, but it's a profound thing. It's like what we saw in that graphic with the Lord of the Rings there with Schmiegel. You have your self-consciousness in another. Children that grow up in a forest, like they get separated from human beings, they become feral children. Their self-consciousness doesn't develop beyond the animalistic stage or the kind of inanimate stage. And there's a certain like structure in the brain that if it doesn't develop these pure thoughts by a certain age, there's like a fixity that starts to form. And so this process is really formative. It can really affect you if it happens young. And when I just told you about the object and all that, there's a lot of metaphysical development that happens before you even start to become conscious. There's a heck of a lot of messed upness that can happen before you even become conscious. But when you are finally conscious as a child, let's say, you're impressionable because of this. You're actually connected to your parents or whoever's influencing you, right? And so there's this horrible way to do it where you can start messing with that pure metaphysical essence, that those pure thoughts, which we think are psychology. It can fragment you even more because you're put into these no-wins. But what's critical here to keep in mind is that a no-win is not yet a double bind. A double bind is more insidious than a no-win situation. A no-win situation can still be rationally sublated. So if you're with two adults and you say, oh, I did one thing, honey, and you did the other thing, honey, and I did the middle thing, honey, it's like, you're still mad at me. That means that the real problem, you're putting me in a no-win. So you're making a meta commentary. You're saying, I'm not choosing a position, like I'm not talking about the content of the conversation. I'm talking about how the conversation is now happening. It's a meta comment. It's a rational comment saying that I can't win this. You're hurting me. And the other person, if they're rational enough, like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean, yeah, you're right. I'm empathizing with you. I'm self-recognizing with your plight and that I'm doing that. Oh, sorry. I love you. I don't want to put you in that situation. What's wrong here is that the real problem has nothing to do with this dialectic at all. We're talking about the wrong topic. It was actually you left the toilet seat up 2 weeks ago and it's really making me mad. And then you talk about that. What does that represent? And now you're actually on the right dialectic. And when you choose a position, you can actually have an actual concrete sublation. That's how a rational person gets out of a no-win situation. What a double bind is, it's like a no-win in a no-win. So the dialectic itself is a no-win. You can't choose a position. They're all wrong. But then when you try and make that meta commentary, when you're trying to raise the reason to a more concrete reasoning, that also is a no-win. You're not allowed to do that. When you try and go to the synthesis or to the sublative point, the concrete moment that reflects back with wisdom on that dialectic, you're not allowed to do that. So if you're with your partner and you say, hey, you're putting me in a no-win situation, and say, oh, are you with the no-win situations again? Oh, blah, 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 blah. And they just erase that too, and they don't get it. That means there's no real way rationally to talk out of that conversation unless you magically read their mind and find the real dialectic. You have to read their minds, right? And this is what men in the stereotype say, oh, I have to read my wife's mind. But the reality is this happens everywhere. And we're all doing it to each other because we're in a horrible sort of abstract global culture where all we know by default is abstract negation. Because until that metaphysical process develops explicitly in our world, you don't become conscious of dialectic until you discover reason philosophically for yourself. You have to, by default, the first part of sublation is always the abstract negation. And that's the part that's kind of explicit at first. It always negates itself. Reason is always in itself, like the objective metaphysical reason is always sublating. But it is slowly making the sublations more and more explicit. And when you're in a double bind situation like this, most people don't know how to get out of it, or that they don't even realize that they're doing it because the philosophical consciousness, the level of concrete reason isn't high enough to actually make that meta commentary. And that's why in psychology, in psychiatry, it is such a tricky disorder that when you go into a borderline personality case with somebody who you think has BPD, you have to go in after consulting a panel of other psychiatrists because it can start twisting your dialectics around. So you can see here in the next paragraph, this is so devastating that it can lead to schizophrenia, PTSD, and then I just added in borderline personality disorder. So the crazy thing here is that double binds are often utilized as a form of control without open coercion. The use of confusion makes them difficult both to respond to and resist. So this kind of metaphysical, this pure thought influence on you has real effects. It has a fixity to it. So this word fixity, I want to make very explicit because Hegel uses this through his entire philosophy to say this is the problem with thinking. This is what ordinary thinking does when it's trying to understand something in a finite way. It doesn't grasp it in that infinite circle of reason. There's no real fluidity to it. But you can fix on somebody and you can control them with this kind of invisible control of pure thought. And you do that by ungrounding the kernel of reason that's in them. The fact, remember what we said earlier, reason is not just something you do and think, it's something that you actually are. It's language kind of speaking you. That's what the laws of the universe actually are. They're the universals coming through in different levels of explication to itself. So this word confusion is incredibly important in creating that fixity, because the opposite, if you look in the comments, the opposite of confusion is what? It's what our philosophers love, and the whole point of philosophy is to create clarity. Confusion is the opposite of clarity. A lot of people don't realize that you achieve this insight into the world just by thinking clearly. It sounds very simple, but double binds are kind of like the opposite of this, where you get so confused, especially if this happens to you as a child, you get so confused in your subconscious that you actually can't untangle them. You can't reason through them anymore. The confusion is so bad because all those prior dialectics that Hegel puts in order in the science of logic, all those in somebody who has BPD are scrambled. And even though they're trying to think their way through, it's kind of like you can have digestion without knowing how digestion works, right? You can still be conscious without having the order explicit to yourself. But if the order is not explicit to your consciousness, you can't align your will with it, which is why as a conscious agent, you can still digest and you can still move and have physical sort of coordination. But when it comes to coordination in that clear thinking, you can't do it except in limited kind of ranges. And if you get triggered, if there's a dialectic that comes into your consciousness and triggers that memory or that confusion, it'll unground you completely, because it's only the order that allows you to be reasonable, to be in the present here and now. So confusion is very important. And the reason why I'm saying this in terms of double binds is that this is exactly what Socrates didn't like about the sophists that he was trying to combat when he came on the scene in history. So sophists, Socrates was frustrated with because they were doing the same thing as Socrates. They were realizing the speculative nature of dialectic, that you could take any position and you're technically always right because there's truth on both sides, right? But they're also different and limited. So there's a lack of truth on both sides. And if you manage to somehow understand the archetypal metaphysical structure of the language of reality, which we know is just logic in the science of logic in its concrete universal form, not its abstract form, then you can do these really sophisticated back and forth that like just mess with people who are stuck in ordinary consciousness in finite thinking. And Socrates realized he had a gift that he had already managed to memorize them in his subconscious. So he already had the order implicit in him. And Hegel said that the only thing with Socrates is that he wasn't really self-consciousness yet. He wasn't what you would call the higher levels of philosophical thinking, because he didn't have the thoughts, the order explicit. He didn't have the science of logic as a system explicit where he could kind of talk about it to people. He just knew that he could do it on particular dialectics, right? That's why Socrates comes early in philosophy. Despite us loving him as one of the greatest philosophers, we actually progressed past him in the last 2,000 years. So, but he was really good at this and noticing that you can do this, but you can do it in a good way, or you can do it in a way that manipulates people. And that's what the sophists were doing. They were tricking people and confusing them on the things that they thought they knew. They would undermine them so that you could unground the reasoning. And when people get ungrounded from the reasoning, what happens? They're like a flag in the wind. You can do whatever you want with them. And I'm seeing that still today in the abstract philosophical community. That's happening. And when ordinary people who don't understand this come into this circle of philosophy, they dislike it because they feel like they're not spirit. They can't bring that out for themselves. So this process is happening all over the world. We need to correct that. And that's what Socrates was trying to correct. And then Plato came and tried to make it more systematic. And then Aristotle came and connected us with the world itself. And then Hegel comes and gives us the full thing. The science of logic is the amazing therapeutic cure to the worst psychological illnesses. It's the cure, what Freud or all these other psychoanalysts were trying to aim for. It's literally a talking cure. That if you can identify which categories are in abstraction, you can go and sublate them and put the order back in so you can give that person the confidence to overcome the speculative nature, the contradictory nature of their subconscious mind. But you have to understand that order. So I kind of agree with Hegel. That is actually the model that's in all of our subconscious minds universally. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white, young, old, in this country, in that country, this time period, that time period. It's the universal. It's that objective world coming through our world. It doesn't change. It's the thing that stays eternal while the rest of our world is fluxing in this infinite becoming. The world of appearances, like we covered in Buddhism. So our goal as philosophers is to overcome this confusion by just introducing clarity with order. And that's what the psychotherapist is trying to do. But the psychotherapist of modern times is doing it without the science of logic, this living logic. They're approximating it in an ordinary finite way, which is why they can still get pulled in and then they can get confused. So psychiatrists, before they go to a borderline personality session, they have to get a bunch of like external reflections to approximate the science of logic, to keep their logic straight, because you can get ungrounded. That's why they're doing that in modern psychology. That's how profound the ordering of these metaphysical categories are that we take for granted every day. Now, the sophists did this with people in the public, but this happens a lot in parent-child relationships. So how does this happen? The ordinary definition of it from Wikipedia goes, a double bind generally includes different levels of abstraction in the order of messages, and these messages can either be stated explicitly or implicitly within the context of the situation, or they can be conveyed by tone of voice or body language. Further complications arise when frequent double binds are part of an ongoing relationship to which the person or group is committed. This is basically childhood. You can't get away from your parent, right? So you are forced to absorb their dialectics. And that's why people become like their parents. And in adolescence, they start realizing their parents' limitations and they start rebelling because their culture is so abstract that the concrete nature of the soul when you're young, or the subconscious, starts to get ripped apart. The freedom that you have in your inner child, that's why children at first are really like free and they're playful. It's because they're connected to concrete thinking at first. And they see the speculative nature of reality. They might not see it in true wisdom yet, but that's where the vitality, that infinite vitality of the notion is coming from. It's not all fragmented and chopped up. It's actually flowing. But then as the child matures, we feel like we have to force them into these pockets, which we kind of do, right? They have to take responsibility, but we're doing it in an abstract order, not in that living order that preserves that vitality. And so we're actually killing the life in our kids, which is why we continually have this like resentment building up in every generation. And so this happens in a really tricky way where we're talking about different levels. We're talking about ongoing compounding situations. We're talking about explicit, implicit. I give you comments on what all these things mean, but I want to sort of give you a sort of diagram on how to think about this. So I'll jump here for a second. This is what's really going on in diagram, in like a diagram. So remember, I talked about in a previous session the ideal philosopher versus the abstract philosopher. So I said philosophers react in negation. Genuine philosophers react in sublation. And I gave you the 16 paths of Parmenides. And I didn't call it Parmenides, I think I call them Parmenides for that. But I'm learning, I'm sublating, right? So these triads down here in the bottom come from that, well, it comes from this, right? This is what we covered last time, where all of our relationships, here's person one and here's person two, right? And all these different types of relationships. And they're all terrible except for this last one. This is where the psychotherapist, this is where the philosopher is trying to get people to. But here's what it looks like in its total horrible wrong form. Negative dialectics at the extreme. Take all those terrible combinations. So like these red dots mean person one is in the first person dialectic. Person two is also in the first person of dialectic. This is called groupthink. There's not actually any reason mediating this. This is just accidental agreement. And you can get it the opposite way around. There's no real reason here because nobody's at this fourth position, which we covered before, which was the position of wisdom. We have the full freedom to think about the extremes and the middle ground. They're just thinking about their position and they're negating the other side, right? So take all these different combinations and then take all these different combinations, which is just the switching, the permutation of the positions to the other side. So now they're in, the person one is in position two, and person two, that let's say the child, is trying to like move around in different positions to try and agree with the person in position one. Here's another one. Now person one, let's say the parent, is switching their position into the third position. The red bar means the middle ground, right? Gray in between black and red, or black and white. And the child here is switching its positions again. Imagine all these kind of confusing combinations mashed into one, and they're all conflicting all at the same time. That's what a double bind is. That's what leads to a double bind over time. So you get these dialectics that we're uncovering, as we saw in the science of logic, are growing into each other. They're actually nested. You know, you kind of get this compounding of either clarity or compounding of confusion. If your base dialectics are not sublated in their dialectical necessity, in their logical necessity, then the next category is going to be just as confused, and then more confused and more confused and more confused. So when you're a child, you might have this concrete totality, and then you get the first negation. And like, I don't know what's going on here. You might kind of survive that and be okay. You're not yet internalizing the trauma. And then it happens again, and then it's a different dialectic. It happens again. And then you kind of realize this dialectic down here is somehow connected to this one, but this one is wrong and this one is wrong. And all the positions on them are also wrong. So then you can't even connect them in that living, growing unity that Hegel shows us is how real logic works in terms of this idea of concretion, of holding it all together in this living unity. So you can start to see how this horrible state of paralysis, this incredible state of fixity where like you can't move at all, every position is wrong on every dialectic. You can see how a child can move into a disorder and internalize this to a point of where they actually give up on thinking entirely and they become completely neurotic. And the sensuousness in their body becomes they become a slave to that because pure thought doesn't have any power. It's so restricted, it's like a barely limping creature of thought, you know, inside of you. You're so damaged that you can barely think. And that's when sensuousness comes in and the particularity overcomes the universal of your consciousness. And you lose control, which is why you turn to drugs, your relationships are unstable, all these things that come with borderline personality disorder or any disorder is kind of like this. Schizophrenia is a really violent back and forth. And so what we need to do is reestablish these arrows of connection. So as the child, if this is the child and this is the parent, you need to allow the meta commentary, the synthesis, the inner connection, not some random external synthesis, which Hegel is against. This has to be a logical synthesis, the true order of things. We have to reestablish that to create fluid thinking and restore the power of explicit thought, which is spirit, right? When it's done right. You reinvigorate the spirit of somebody with borderline personality disorder to self-determine for themselves. That's what the science of logic is. That's the ultimate therapy that all the other therapies are trying to approximate. And when you get an epiphany and you're doing work in psychotherapy, you're trying to create that connection, that synthesis on a broken dialectic, and you're doing it one at a time. You'll do maybe this one, maybe this top one, but this one is connected to a bottom one and a more fundamental one. And then you finally get to the first one in your way in your childhood, really early. This is the foundational one. When this one heals, then it's like a cascade of clarity. That's when you get the really big life-changing epiphanies where you can actually make substantial change and overcome the life habits at that point. You can overcome addictions. You overcome the sensuous fixity that was holding you. You can actually embrace the universal logic. Your inner philosopher starts to come out. And that's all we're doing. We're just sublating dialectics that weren't allowed to be sublated and have compounded in this nested way. So you can see here, I don't know how well you can see it, but when you are allowed to think back into the concrete unity, this synthesis, when you're allowed to talk about it, when you get into a no-win, you can say, hey, I'm in a no-win. You talk about this one, but that one's also sublated because it has an opposite too, but you're allowed to sublate that one as well. And that one also has one, and you can sublate that as well. And that's where the fixity, that paralysis starts to go away. Because nobody understands the science of logic. We're all in some version of this. That's why we're all neurotic and we can't have stable friendships over long periods of time. You can have very natural, maybe organic marriages, but those are extremely rare. So we need to restore this connection, this kind of synthetic thinking of the logic. And Pat Benatar, has this famous song where it says, hell is for children. This stuff happens young. And we need to sort of have a revolution in parenting to restore this concrete logic, or else all of our relationships, no matter what combination we get into, is some version of this. Now, what is this? I'm going to give you an example really quickly here. We're running out of time. But imagine this first person's the parent, and the child is trying to appease their parent in the beginning. Let's say that the child actually reaches stage number 4 in this dialectic here. The child reaches philosophical consciousness. They're like an indigo child, and like, I realize what I'm supposed to think on this dialectic. The parents will recognize that. Not explicitly, because if it was explicit to them, they would start healing. Their subconscious recognizes this, and they will intentionally undermine it by jumping to the other side subconsciously and start negating the child from the other side. So even if the child starts to gain clarity, the parent starts moving. And they move between all the positions and start rotating. That's what the sophist does to unground somebody. If we teach people the triad and how to think it in the proper syllogism, not in this dead way that Kant was doing, that's how you empower people, including children, to stop the sophist by forcing them to be clear on their terms. And you can be clear in even though the nature of thought is contradictory and you can move all over the place, you can still make a logical formal determination. That's how Hegel was able to take this continuous circle of reason that contradictorily circles back on itself, where the beginning is the end is the beginning, all this kind of stuff. He could start it. You can start eternity in a formal way and actually put things in determinate order. And that's what we need to teach people to do as genuine philosophers, and do it in a loving way. Because a lot of people are doing the sophism without realizing it, especially our really high IQ people and our damaged children. Children that have BPD are often the most sensitive children that aren't allowed to get in touch with that incredible vitality and sensitivity. So it leads to 2 extreme responses. So if you're not allowed to think with this incredible, like indigo child, like spiritual, universal knowledge that's implicit in you as a living spirit, a deep old soul, you might call it in terms of mystical language, or just a prescient child, then you will dissociate. It's such an extreme disconnection for those types of consciousness that there's only 2 responses. You totally abstract from the whole situation. You just abstractly negate the whole, I'm just stepping away. And you literally go into a zombie mode called dissociation, where you just become unresponsive. That's actually a rational response to this kind of logic. But we treat it as an illness, but it's actually a smart response to this level of trauma. So we have to reinvigorate the right understanding of that mode of response. And then the opposite of that is that somebody hyper intelligent will try and do the dance. They will also start splitting and going to the extremes, trying to figure out how to outdance this thing that they don't know. It's like an invisible thing. And so they'll love you and then they'll hate you. They'll hate you and they'll love you. And it happens on every dialectic that they haven't sublated. So that explains the logic behind those responses. And the only way to solve that is by returning the living connection, the fluidity of the reason, by literally, it sounds so simple, just allowing the order of the categories to grow in their dialectical necessity in the circle of reason and allowing it to complete itself. The more complete that circle is, the more ordered it is, the more philosophical you become, and the more concrete your wisdom is. That's when you achieve this final freedom, when both people are in sublation, are looking at all the dialectics already sublated in themselves. Okay, dialectical behavior therapy is trying to approximate this, and it's doing this in an abstract way, but the woman who invented this dialectical behavior therapy didn't get it from Hegel. She got it from Buddhism. And why did she get it from Buddhism? Well, we sublated Buddhism already. It was grasping this universality behind appearances and sensuousness. So they're trying to break people away from the sensuousness, but really they're just trying to get people back to the universal. And Hegel's the only one that has connected all the categories, so it supercharges dialectical behavior therapy. That's what we're going to bring in here, and that's going to create profound therapies in the psychoanalytical world, and basically in every single discipline in science today, because we are returning philosophy back to its rightful place as the universal knowledge, where all the other particular knowledges are in it in their proper order. Right now, philosophy is not there. It's in its particular amongst all the other particulars. It's abstracted from its own nature. So this is why once we grasp what Hegel has done, we actually can improve literally everything. And it really profoundly heals people. And that's what we need to do, because almost everybody in society today around the globe is some kind of traumatized child, because they don't have the logic in them. They're not allowed to know it. That's why philosophy is the answer. So the other thing that Adorno says, which I will cover in the last 6 minutes here, he says, when I speak of negative dialectics, so the previous quote was him saying, horror is beyond psychology. What we're showing here that it is beyond, it's the metaphysical logic, right? But when you grasp the broken metaphysical dialectics, you realize that the negative moment actually it leads to the positive moment, but you have to have the order. And then you get into the right way of thinking about psychology as this like interconnectedness that needs to flow. And that the metaphysics itself doesn't stay in that negation either. So the psychology model doesn't stay in the negation, and the metaphysics doesn't stay in the negation. They both kind of complete themselves as the same logic repeating itself in supersensuous form and corporeality, hypostasis, or whatever you want to call it. So now we've kind of like moved on. Adorno wasn't clear enough to have that distinction, I don't think. So the next thing is he says, when I speak of negative dialectics, not the least important reason for doing so is my desire to dissociate myself from this fetishization of the positive. Now, it's kind of interesting that he's using the word dissociate, because we just talked about that in borderline personality disorder, right? But of course, he's not that extreme. He's just really making clear, I'm making an extreme negation of the positive to break this fixity that's in it. But Hegel already did it. When you first get into dialectics, you learn that Hegel is a negative philosopher. You can't get rid of the negation. That's his point. So most of human history, as the negation is coming from that metaphysical world and working its way through corporeality as the progress of spirit, the progress of that concrete reason of the philosopher. That's why philosophy also develops with history. It's actually getting better, even though it doesn't look that way. It's what Hegel calls the slaughter bench of history. And it's just the negation working its way through violently. But violence doesn't have to be associated with negation. Negation is just a universal form of logic that is just the moment of otherness, so you can know yourself explicitly. It's the moment of knowledge. So it actually can change its nature. It actually gets less violent over time as reason starts to sublate it. And in my reading, Hegel actually reaches a point where you become so aware of this that any no-win situation you get put into in any epoch, you just start sublating, because it's a moment not to be resisted. The negative moment is not to be resisted. You're supposed to sublate it. So you get rid of the violence, but you don't get rid of the negation. And that's what I think Adorno is doing. He's kind of saying that Hegel's in this positivity is throwing out the negation, because he's saying that things become spirit and all blessedness and stuff, but it doesn't. When you think you're having essence of like peace, something happens to undermine it every single time. Well, that's because our ignorance doesn't see it coming in a certain way. But over time, you reach such a level of coherence that you can actually overcome that with the order of thinking. So it might negate you, but it's like you understand it enough in its context that you immediately start sublating it. Science is actually peaceful. It's a lot more peaceful than having two armies warring over God, right? So I think this is what Adorno is trying to overcome, or trying to say. He's trying to say this fixity of the positive, this irrationality, right? And the definition of what fetishism is this magical sort of, it fixes your attention and like your awe on this object, this positivity. It makes you unreasonable. You're not thinking through it. It's this beyond, right? Stuff we already covered. And then it throws in an extra connotation of sexual desire. But as we talked about before, sensuousness is just another form of fixity. And so he's really saying this positivity has this fixity to it that we need to unfix with this negation. But Hegel says this is just the fixity of the understanding. You sort of need the understanding to fix concepts, but they always kind of turn into each other at the extreme. But if you know that, you can actually embrace it, and you can embrace them as moments. When they turn into moments, they are sublated, right? But that's actually reason. So remember, the three sides of logic can be described in a different way. Abstract understanding is the first way, right? Abstract understanding, dialectic, and sublation. But you can also describe it in terms of reason. We have abstract understanding, then negative reason. So we get reason there, the opposite of understanding. And then you get the positive reason. So you actually have two moments to reason to form concrete reason. But then you arrive back at understanding again. So I really spent too much time on this, but I give you a couple of quotes here about how the understanding and reason turn into each other. They are also in a dialectic between fixity and fluidity, And he gives this kind of capitalization to the word sometimes. So understanding with a capital and understanding with a lower, reason with a capital, reason with a lower. He's flowing in the comment here. He's flowing between the noun forms, the fixity, the abstract understanding that's holding it still as a concept. And he's going between the process version of that stage, kind of like the language games of Wittgenstein, right? You have to, your process is in the form of your noun. Your world, the limit of your world is the limit of your language, of your thinking, right? Of your logic. And the borderline really has a scattered way of doing this. But when you have real concrete reason, you think genuinely reasonably, and that means that your understanding is comprehensive. So when you have a comprehensive understanding, that doesn't mean you're necessarily irrational. It just means what you're fixing on is actually the true total. The whole is the truth. And you can reason through it in that understanding. So you get this speculative blend of the true understanding of the philosopher, but the reasoning of the philosopher too. You're fixing categories, but you're letting them go fluid. You're fixing, letting them go fluid. And you know when to do that in the right order. That's what the philosopher does. That's the true profound clarity that leads to wisdom. And that's what philosophers are striving for. So I'm just going to go over this quote kind of quickly and say, Adorno doesn't seem to have grasped this. He seems to have taken Hegel and his profound speculative clarity and abstracted him into a single moment of abstract understanding to make him easy to negate. But Hegel was on both sides of the dialectic here. And he's repeating what Adorno said above. He says, Hegel agrees, this fetishism of the positive is a problem. But it's the nature of that positive that's the problem. And we already discovered what that is. It's indeterminate. You're not allowed to think it and know what it is. You're not allowed to investigate your own thought categories. And he actually goes one step further and he says, it is easy work for the understanding to show that everything said of the idea is self-contradictory. The idea here, think about it as the concrete whole. Like once all that logic is completed and it goes around in the circle of reason and all the categories are no longer in their abstract understanding, they're not all disoriented in the borderline personality. We did really good therapy and we actually restored the whole circle of reason. When it's complete and it circles back on itself in that determinate order, it's not an indeterminate circle where you're just saying it's some kind of beginning is end thing. It's you can actually think your way around it because you have the thought categories in their dialectical connection. They grow into each other in a living way, like a plant. So the idea, he says women are like the idea because their intuition is kind of like that. They already, if they're not traumatized, they can do that. They just know, but they don't know how they know. It's mother's intuition, all this kind of stuff. But the real philosopher has this in a masculine and a feminine way. You think it and you know it. You think it and you know it and you intuit it all at the same time. The idea has this concept of completion to it. So think of it that way. So then Adorno comes and says, well, you think you have it complete. That's the trick. That's the positivity that's fetishizing. You got to realize that that's going to undermine itself. So don't hold on to it. And Hegel is saying, yes, that's to negate that completeness. And he's saying, I think that's what he's saying. Like, that's what Adorno is doing, is he's doing the easy thing. The hard thing, he's doing the easy way of negation as opposed to the easy way of doing positivity. So they're actually in the same abstract relationship. He's saying that the real way to think about this is by concrete positivity, where you have the negation inside of the positivity. And you can say, well, Adorno knew that. And he was saying, no, the sublation doesn't lead to the unification. It actually leads to another dissociation. But that's the speculative moment that Hegel already covers. That's why he says the divine idea itself, but when it others itself back to the beginning in this kind of circle that doesn't get rid of the goodness. And you can embrace this way of thinking and still overcome this horror that seems to come by a surprise of the unknown. So I give you more of the paragraph. You can read that there if you'd like. He says, look, the idea is but the thing to remember with this concept of completion is that he says at the end, the idea is the eternal vision of itself in the other, the notion which in its objectivity has carried out itself, object which is essential and subjectivity. What he's saying here sounds a lot like Heidegger, right? This vision, this moment of vision, being is revealed in its clarity. Well, the idea, when you're in process of this realization, it's actually an illusion. Remember, it's cunning of reason. The idea has always been complete. It's eternal. The science of logic is piece that thinks it doesn't. Process. But once you're in the process of completion, when you arrive,
need to go through
it has already been done. So I give you a quote here from the Science of Logic of where he says every stage is just this. It's this kind of like everything that we think we're doing as a progress is really return back to this metaphysical realm that's complete. So this word has carried out is the logic that's in you.
Sorry.
And when you start grasping it, it starts to feel like flow states, right? Because flow states have that type as an approximation of that super healing of the metaphysical world. Yeah, Cynthia?
I only caught part of what you said because someone needs to mute their thing. So you might want to cover that last little bit again, please.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, can you mute James?
Okay.
So
James, can you mute yourself? I don't know.
well, what's going on here?
It's actually on.
Oh, yeah, there was some kind of interruption voice.
James is unmuted. He's having a conversation with someone.
Got it. Maybe we can edit these videos later and cut that out. But practical spirit rears its Adorno horrible head. Maybe not to say that you're horrible, James, but please turn your mic off. Okay, if you guys would like to hear this again, there's something really paradoxical about the idea. And the idea is that how do you overcome this element of horror, this metaphysical horror? Well, you overcome it by realizing that the process that looks horrible that you're in is actually already completed. So you're really just returning to completion. It's not something that actually is horrible. It's you as choosing through the cunning of reason to not know. And that ignorance, that gap in knowledge is what allows the eternal completion to flow. And that's what you are. That's that concrete God thing that I talked about, that apotheosis, that theopoiosis in the religious sense. But when you actually get to completion, the funny thing is that you realize that it was already perfect. You just didn't realize it. And the reason you didn't realize it is because you didn't recognize the order. You didn't see yourself in the logical order that Hegel puts in the Science of Logic in the world. So you have your self-consciousness in the other. That includes other people, but also the world itself. All the dialectics are all the same essence. And it's a determinate essence that you can know. So that in the process of bringing it out, that negative moment, the horrible moment, the negative dialectic, the critical moment that Adorno wants us to focus on, you realize that at the end of that is really just goodness. And you have to have the faith that the world is rational because the idea is already complete. So when you get there, you realize it's already done. It's a circular thing. So it's why it's not always horrible. It's just that the good has to be thought for yourself. Somebody can't do it for you. You have to do it for yourself, or else the negation will come through you through your own ignorance. So that's Hegel's big lesson here. If you leave it in terms of indeterminate positivity, you will make the mistake of Adorno. But that's not what Hegel was saying. Hegel was saying something much more profound. So I'm not a huge Adorno scholar yet, but what I have read, it seems like that's the mistake that he's making. That's the abstraction. Hegel already did it. And he's doing it kind of through this concept of the idea. But that's not to say that negation stops. There is always this negative, but it happens in a funny way. So I give you another quote of how Hegel says, reason here is active in the shape of understanding. So it's not just me saying they're changing into each other. He actually does say they go into each other back and forth. That's why it's confusing. I understand something, but I don't. Well, a moment is a combination between holding them solid, but also as moments, right? That's the speculative way to understand that. A moment is that relationship, sublated. He's saying that, I give you an example of geometry again for our math majors, how people discovered in science that this contradictory stuff happens in science. So that the thing that Adorno wants to re-implement, Hegel says you can still have science and still have positivity. That's actually what's happening. It's overcoming its own contradictions. And you do arrive at truth. There is something stable that starts to happen. Even if it starts undermining itself, it starts to have this coherence to it that starts to feel more and more complete. Because it's the science of sciences, right? It starts to take all the abstract bits and starts to sublate them into a whole, the one science of sciences. And it's what religion was calling God, but you can look at it secularly too. Atheists are just trying to make God concrete, you could say. They're trying to make yourself, the Ubermensch, concrete, if you want to look at it existentially. Returning to your greatest potential as ideal self. So this is how you kind of overcome the horror, is by having the real clarity on what the process really is, what concretion really means, and being prepared to invite in the negation as a process of self-recognition, of self-consciousness, and not hold yourself into those double binds and all that kind of stuff. Stop putting other people in double binds, and your life becomes more blessed in yourself and in the relationships around you. Okay, this is how you really live. I hope I'm clarifying the logic more. I said this before, I'm saying the same thing in every session, right? But it's getting more and more concrete, but it's becoming more and more complicated, it seems. But I give you another paragraph here where Hegel directly links this to the purpose of communication again. So this is the kind of communication that we need, that resolves that kind of communication we talked about at the beginning. And he's saying that spiritual communication is actually the universals. So the science of logic is the universal knowledge, right? When you communicate with that kind of knowledge, that's what real spiritual communication is. The inward communication that Jesus was talking about, the church, Buddha was talking about with Nirvana. This is really it in logical form, in the form of the notion, which is universals, particulars, and individuals. I hope this is becoming more concrete, okay? It might not for the new people, but there's an understanding of this when you're a philosopher. And in ancient history, I'm going over a little bit now, but I hope you don't mind. Ancient wisdom grasped this already, but they did it in sensuous form. That's the problem, right? That's why it's religious consciousness, and it wasn't yet genuinely philosophical consciousness, because they couldn't put this into scientific form. But leadership, so to develop leadership in tribes, especially in indigenous tribes, what they used to do to try and force sublation, because the only true loving leadership is sublation, a spirit of sublation. So what they did is they took somebody that wanted to be a leader, and they would put them in the town square or the village square or the tribe square or wherever they had a public gathering, and they would tie up that person and they would make them sit there for days. And everybody in the village or in the community would come and negate them and say, look what you did. The way you lived your life to this point, you actually negated me here, here, and here. And they get a chance to negate them when they're defenseless. They can't negate back, right? So it prevents them from abstractly negating an abstract negation, which just keeps the negative moment spinning. So it forces them to listen and be vulnerable, which means you have to listen to their truth all the way. And that starts to create that completion of the idea that allows you to genuinely sublate and restore your relationships with the community that have been abstracted as you were learning from childhood. And so it's a brilliant way. It's a scary way, though. It's very horrible if somebody comes and actually hurts you, right? But it's a brilliant kind of way to try and get philosophy or try and get this sublation in the community, in the leaders, and then start to teach that to the children so that we're not traumatizing them. So there was this wisdom in earlier forms, but because they couldn't put it in sensuous form, it always had this caprice to it, this kind of mystical superstition. And the superstition would get fixed on and undermine the wisdom, which caused this back and forth, this horrible back and forth, which we now finally have the clarity, thanks to Hegel, to turn into a science that we can think explicitly for ourselves. But that's what we're doing. That's why we can go into all the other religions and all the other modes and just bring out the brilliance of what they were actually doing. You don't have to question them. So I give you one more quote of where Hegel makes philosophy, this process, explicitly the purpose of philosophy. It's the purpose. This absolute unity, but it's not the naive kind that Adorno was talking about, it seems like. You can end horror, but you have to do it with explicit clarity. You have to grasp everything as a dynamic element of the idea, this concrete way of thinking. Okay, so this is what we're doing practically. So philosophy is practical, right? We're going to be healing people. So people say, oh, you're just going to be a psychotherapist. Well, real friendship, real love is therapeutic. You can't help it. So philosophers, real genuine philosophers, are therapeutic. When you get really good at this, you take the vow of unabandonment because you have faith that it's just the same thing. People just have broken dialectics. And your job now as a philosopher is to study the science of logic. And when somebody's talking to you, identify the universals in their language and how they're moving in speculative form, but in a broken way in their logic. And the faster you get at identifying that and the order, the faster you can start making corrections for them. But you want to make it explicit, like this is what I'm doing. And then this way they don't feel manipulated. You're not doing sophism. You are being honest with them and saying, this is the point of philosophy and wisdom, is to make it explicit for you. You're supposed to do this for yourself. Me as your friend, I'm an external agent helping you, but eventually my goal, if I'm not allowing you to do this for yourself, you're not really doing philosophy. You're doing some kind of sophism. You're trying to use your clarity, your power over them in thought to make them feel lesser, like they can't do it. So you always want to reinvigorate that central message of Hegel, which is this has to be self-determined. You have to do it with the spirit in yourself because you are a rational structure. You are a rational creature that can achieve it. So that's what we're going to be doing over and over again. This is what the peaceful revolution is. This is how you sublate the violence of the revolution by preserving the negation. We're not being naive and getting rid of it like Adorno thinks, right? We are 100% doing the negative moment of logic and the positive. And so you can go on the Hegelians who want to change the world Facebook group, put your negations on there, put your sublations. We're just going to have the vow of unabandonment and just keep trusting that the world is rational and that there is an order that we can sublate by recognizing the universals. If you're not sure how good you are at this, that's what the wisdom quiz is for. The first part of real leadership has to be sublating all those broken dialectics that we absorbed through our childhoods. And then it just tests to see where they're broken. Then we start sublating them. The positions don't really matter. It just matters the process of you knowing how to get out of the no-wins and get out of the no-win of no-wins. The synchronicity document is once you realize the process, we can go to all the philosophers like Hegel did and just start putting them into their universal order. Because we were all doing that. We're all wise, just in fragmented ways. That's where we're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, probably. The CRISPR, our technologies, if you want to start doing this with the exponential stuff, you can join the CRISPR group. You can use the 16 passive harmonites to try and stay clear on where you are in this foray of like confusion. The Universal Survey of Wisdom is what we're going to use globally to figure out where the borderline personality disorder is in our global consciousness, basically, and start finding the best and most efficacious ways to start sublating. One of the big ones is between religion and philosophy itself. If you want to send somebody who's really intelligent to sublate with me and they think they got a gotcha, like an Adorno, gotcha, you thought you knew it, but here's the negative, I will try and sublate them on these live calls in a sort of spectator sport. It gives you a kind of confidence, but not a hubris, because you're aware that the negation is coming, right? So you invite it in. That's what makes it ideal, and that's what makes an ideal state. You're allowed to make mistakes, and you're supported in that. The universal of the state is to protect the individual, and the individual has a duty to the state. It's actually a back and forth. It's not this totalitarian parental double bind stuff going on. You're allowed to learn the truth. And so tomorrow, there's a universal form of reason which helps you stay clear on the structure of the triad, because there's a wrong way to do that. So I'm trying to get you to do it the right way that Hegel says. But tomorrow, we're going to cover an extension of this. Today, we covered this in the individual, like how to get your own double binds healed, right? To start the process, how to read the logic in this profoundly healing way. It looks super dry and boring, right? That's because of ordinary consciousness chopping it up. We're so fragmented, we can't even see the living nature of it. We're going to heal ourselves as philosophers, right? You know, be the change you want to see in the world. Heal yourself first before you go out. But now that we're healing ourselves, we can do this in the world. And the world spirit has been trying to do this, but it's been doing it in a fragmented way, which is why it has created pain as it's been progressing to the negative dialectic. Okay, so tomorrow we will be covering colonialism and a couple of other historical facts in their metaphysical logic. And until then, I hope you enjoyed this and found it interesting, and that you stay free and keep sublating yourself.
Mark. Sorry.
The-
Mark.